What is up, guys? I know it's crazy. 2 pods in one night. How about us? And we've recorded 3 podcasts today about 3 different topics. So that's kind of crazy. But this one is going to be on the PFL and the drama that's kind of been surrounding them lately that we've been seeing on social media with many Bellator champions. And the whole story right now, a lot of the Bellator champions have been complaining on Twitter about not being able to get fights or fights falling through at the last minute, and then obviously that leading to them not being paid and not being able to make a living off of fighting, which is what they're there for. And I'll read some of the tweets too right now. Patchy Mix, Corey Anderson, Patricio Pitbull, 3 of the fighters who have talked openly right now against the PFL and what's been going on. Also, other fighters have mentioned it too, but those are like the 3 big names. Patricio Pitbull, he said, I haven't fought since February. I wanted to fight 3 times this year, but I was told I'd have to wait until December 31st and found out online that my opponent would fight someone else. Then they had a replacement. I bring people over, spend more money with the camp, and there's no fight. I'm very worried about the future of Bellator and MMA in general. I feel very sorry for all the fighters who didn't even get to fight this year or were cut because they just don't make shows or think that they're too expensive, and all the fighters who were forced to take pay cuts. This is wrong. We need answers. We need the fighters and fans to be respected. This is not a game or just some business. These are people's lives we're talking about. A serious promotion would give fighters the chance to fight at least 3 times a year if they're healthy. Patchy Mix, he said, I've been training my ass off for the last year, half of the year, for nothing. This is frustrating in the prime of my career, and I've had my fight in November canceled. Then now again, I'm being told I'm off the January Dubai card. I'm the best in the world, and I want to fight to prove it. And then Corey Anderson, he left his a little more lighthearted, but he's still kind of echoing the same sentiments. Aging like warm cheese over here, waiting for at PFL MMA to give me a call. But don't get it twisted. We still ready to defend the strap against anybody, young or old. So it's rough to see these really fun fighters that the PFL has not being given fights and feeling like they're being slighted in a way by their promotion, because these are people that the PFL should be building around. I mean, all 3 of those guys I just read tweets from are 3 of the better fighters in the promotion and in the sport in general. I mean, they could be stacked up against UFC fighters. Obviously, Corey Anderson has been at the top of the light heavyweight division in the UFC, but like Patchy Mix and Pitbull, those are guys I'd love to see fight against the best in the world in the UFC. But right now, the PFL has them, and they have these star fighters, these assets, and they're treating them in such a dumb way. And we've seen this more and more with other promotions lately with, what's going on with One Championship. When Renier de Ritter, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, how he said that One Championship wasn't giving him fights at the end of his run there. And, now we've also seen Mikey Musumeci come over to the UFC for grappling right now and says he wants to fight at some point for the UFC too. And, he had that whole debacle with the weight cut that went wrong, and then they stripped him of the title basically for trying to save an event. Then Sage Northcutt, similar type of thing, was pulled from fights, and he said that One Championship lied about the reasoning of it, and that led to his release from One. And my whole point with this is that what's going on right now with the PFL and One Championship and fighters speaking out against them, it just shows you that the UFC is number one, and it really feels like they're probably going to stay there for a while. Because, yeah, there's issues with fighter pay and stuff like that, but one thing that the UFC does offer is reliability. If you're a fighter and you're healthy, to Patricio Pitbull's point, if you want to fight 3 times a year, the UFC will get you 3 fights. So that's one thing that UFC fighters don't have to worry about, even if you want to bring up the argument with fighter pay. At least they're getting fights to be paid for. So that's my whole take on it. But what do you think of this weird little drama that's been popping up lately with the PFL?
Yeah, it just goes more to just once again how we had that whole talk about the whole Bellator thing and how they're taking under. It's like you own Bellator now. Like, you don't have to. They're not 2 separate things anymore. Like, you own Bellator. You have the power to give these guys even more fights than they were able to before, and
somehow they're getting none, which makes no sense.
Just to circle back to Francis Ngannou's fight, I guess thing with PFL is with them is like they'll have that big event and then just
It's like they
go.
neglect everything else.
Yeah, and that's the issue there. Maybe they're just putting their eggs into too many eggs into one basket, and
Well, you know what I think it is? I think they're trying to put one egg into a bunch of different baskets. Because remember we
yeah,
talked about the one day how like the PFL is just confusing right now because there's the Bellator Champion Series, there's like PFL Europe, there's going to be PFL Africa at some point because of Francis Ngannou. There's already the actual normal PFL season. You have the PFL Super Fights, and I've already lost track of what I've said and hadn't said. Like that's my point. It's just unless you're really dialed in, it's very hard to follow, and it's overcomplicating it for no real reason. And like these Bellator fighters who have come over from there, obviously in the merger, they're complaining about not getting fights. And like you said, it's not like they don't have the resources to have them fight. I just don't. I don't get it, and you have to wonder what's going on right now and how long the PFL is going to be able to hold on to these guys. Because Corey Anderson, I would say, is probably going to stay there just because he seems to be making good money there when he is fighting, and plus he's already been in the UFC.
man.
But the other two, why would Patchy Mix and Patricio Pitbull stay at an organization where they don't feel like they're getting fights that they should be getting, and when there's promotions like the UFC out there where people want to see them fight anyway? Like when their contracts are up, why would you not test free agency and go over there
Yeah.
and prove something else? You know,
That's the unfortunate thing is, while this is boxing, combat sports in general. This is prize fighting at the end of the day, but how much do you really want somebody to just, oh, well, they pay me good enough, so screw everything else. This is like, don't you want this, like someone like Corey Anderson who's holding a title for you? Don't you want for him to be one of the faces of your company and
or even
like be
Patchy
able to
Mix.
market him and stuff? And
I think Patchy Mix has an argument to be the best bantamweight in the world, and
yeah,
like
and nobody would
we're not
know
seeing
it.
him fight. Like it's mind boggling, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and so that's like the struggle with one in PFL is these are great fighters that want to fight, that are willing to fight for them and stuff, and clearly these organizations, well, maybe not so much one with how they've let De Ritter go and Mikey go, but at least with PFL, like they're compensating these fighters right. It's just well,
Well, if you're not fighting, though, you're
if
not
you're
getting
not fighting,
compensated.
well,
That's the
yeah,
problem.
actually,
Like,
yeah,
you know,
that
yeah,
too,
like sure,
yeah.
Corey Anderson's getting paid a ton of money, but if Corey Anderson's not fighting,
Uh-huh.
what does that really mean? That's
It's
the good thing about the PFL is like if you're in the season format and you win it, you get the $1 million. So maybe you don't need to fight for a year. But if you're a professional fighter and you're the best in the world at something, these guys are athletes. They want to compete. They're not, like you said, they're not just all in for the money. I mean, yeah, that's a factor of it. This is their job at the end of the day. But
yeah,
when
dude.
they're not getting
Like
fights,
the
they're not getting
whole
paid.
like the whole point of PFL and Bellator is coming together so that they could create this one big organization that could stand toe to toe with UFC. But now it's just like they did that part, and it's like
They've really fumbled everything since.
Yeah, it's
Besides
just been-
Francis, the Francis Ngannou stuff they've handled pretty well
it's
so
just
far.
been this
But
state of just stagnant sort of state, and then there's just no real progress being made since
which
then.
is crazy considering the momentum that they had when they got Francis Ngannou, bought
Yeah.
Bellator. You're like, this is going to be a new
Mhm.
number 2 promotion, possibly a promotion that could fight with the UFC, no pun intended. But now it just seems like the UFC is clearly number 1, and the organizations that we see as like the number 2, number 3, those ones
Yeah,
are kind
dude.
of in shambles at the moment with their fighters. PFL, their current roster is talking against them, and one
Yeah.
championship has had so many fighters leave and say these things. It's like the UFC is number 1, but this is so bad for the market
Yeah.
because now there's not really a valid. I mean, like PFL and one championship are obviously still options, but now you have to, as a free agent, you have to wonder, well, if I go to one of these places, am I going to get fights? Am I going to be
Yeah.
treated professionally? Like, it's not a good look, man.
Like Pitbull, Corey Anderson, Patchy Mix, like these guys were still fighting really great fighters when Bellator was its own thing,
Mhm.
and now they're not getting fights at all, and it just makes you think like, well, is PFL really gonna keep these guys just for that one big fight a year or something like that? And like, dude, these guys want to fight 3 times a year, so why limit them like that? When they're only gonna get they're not gonna get any younger. Like Patchy Mix is saying, like, I'm in my prime right now. I want to fight right now. I want to prove I'm the best bantamweight right now.
And then
So
Corey Anderson and Pitbull, they're older. Like, they're older fighters and
yeah,
don't have much time left in their athletic window. And it's just a shame to see them all sitting on the sidelines. I love watching all these guys fight. And when they were in Bellator, I would make it a point to tune into their fight when I'd hear about it, because me and you have had our
yeah,
conversations
dude.
about Bellator marketing. But
Yeah, man. And it
it's a
seems like,
shame.
yeah, it's just unfortunate. It seems like even now with PFL and Bellator coming together, they still have that sort of marketing issue of sorts. But, like, hopefully just something, because we do want that competition for UFC. We do want the sport of MMA to keep expanding and growing to more audiences and stuff. And just the fighters themselves. Like, these are all guys that are capable of fighting for UFC, but here they are at PFL. They're should be the face of PFL. They're holding titles for PFL. Like, you gotta make the strike while the iron's hot, pretty much.
Yeah,
They haven't done that.
the PFL, they buy Bellator and they get these guys like Patchy Mix, Corey Anderson, Patricio Pitbull, and instead of taking advantage of having more talent on their roster, instead they
Yeah,
sit them on the sidelines and they squander it. It makes no
they'll
sense.
sit
Like,
them on the sidelines, or now that they're sitting on the sidelines, before that, it's like, oh, well, here's the PFL champions versus the Bellator champions, and it's like, you just, I guess it's a, yeah, I guess it's a way, maybe just some sort of overthinking, or like you said, putting one egg into too many baskets, but
yeah, it's just a shame to see these three great fighters sitting on the sidelines when they should be in the cage showing us how good they are and creating good storylines like, oh, could
yeah,
Patchy
dude.
Mix beat Marab? Well, nobody's going to be saying that if Patchy Mix isn't fighting. So it's a shame that these guys are sitting on the sidelines right now, and it's a tough thing to see this story pop up. And yeah, I mean, that's all I really have on it. I just thought it was worth bringing up because we've seen it so much in the news lately, and it's odd to see
Well,
multiple
yeah,
high
and
level
that's the
fighters
issue,
calling them out.
right? Where it's like PFL, Bellator, they don't get uh this kind of coverage or attention anyways, and when they do, it's for something like this.
Yeah, it's true. I
Just
mean,
sucks.
we've definitely had more podcasts criticizing their promotion than I feel like we've had praising them,
Yeah,
which is
dude.
nuts
And it's like,
considering
yeah,
like
they did. I, I gave them, before PFL Battle of the Giants, when we were previewing at the end of the pod before that, was like, you would think that PFL, this is one that they have to get right,
and they did
and
to
they
their
did.
credit.
And they did, and we gave them props for it and stuff, and everyone was thrilled about Francis's big return and all that and getting a win. But
And to put it in like graph form for people, so what you're saying pretty much is it went all the way up and then
yeah,
all
dude.
like
Whereas
they have not
UFC,
taken advantage of momentum.
they are super important fights every week. Something to talk about every week. There's some sort of turnover every single week.
And to be fair, like to PFL and like one championship, more so the PFL because one championship has more events, I think. But like the PFL, I'm not saying that they have to be on the same level as the UFC,
No.
like events every week, like you're saying. But it's the fact that they have multiple stars and they're not taking advantage of having
Yeah.
those stars. And, you could have so many more big events. Because remember, I think my point was like, instead of having all these different things, why don't they just combine it all and then they could have maybe like 1 or 2 good events per month rather than just having, oh, well, we're having our super fights event in November, then we're having the PFL season to start. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's just so much. And if you're a casual fan, you're never going to buy, because the UFC is just so much simpler. Like, if you're not a real fight fan,
Yeah.
obviously there's people like us who are going to pay attention to both. But to speak to the casual fan, you see fighters criticizing their own promotion. They have maybe like 2 to 3 great events per year mixed with a bunch of duds. It's a tough thing to watch because the PFL, they have all of the resources to be the clear number 2 and possibly challenge the UFC for that number 1 spot, but they've just shot themselves in the foot so much. And it's a shame to watch, man. It really is. But
Yeah,
it is
you
what it
wanna
is.
you wanna you wanna give us the fans like one, sure, things to be looking forward to and excited about. So just like all the events that you were just mentioning and stuff, it's good to have that vision and say like, yeah, this is what we're gonna go through with and stuff. But when we all come in agreement with something like this, like, dude, these people need fights, like, what's going on and stuff like that. And whereas these events that are being talked about that are going to happen, but we don't know anything about them, it's like you're not giving us anything to really talk about other than what you should be doing that you're not doing.
Yeah, and like we're not gonna have a podcast every week criticizing them, you know what
Yeah,
I mean? Like,
exactly.
but this is
But
one of those
we want
things.
to talk about PFL more,
They just
but
haven't given us many
they're not
good
giving us
things to
anything
talk
to
about.
talk about except why their champions are just sitting collecting dust.
Yeah, it's like we don't even have any real opportunities to talk about good fight nights because there's so few of them, and there's been so few of them. And then the only story that pops up is because three of their most popular champions are shitting on the organization a little bit. It's a tough spot they've put themselves in, man. It really is. And I like the PFL. I think that they're doing some things really well, but then I think they're doing other things really poorly, and I want them to do well.
Yeah, man. It's like
Any MMA fan would want them to do well. Competition for the UFC is what you want because it'll ultimately force the UFC to be better. Like when there was Strikeforce, Pride, the WEC, like that forced the UFC to make bigger fights and go after people in different promotions. Like right now, the UFC is so clearly number one. The PFL, like that's not a threat to them right now. There's just not. So and things like this are not helping them.
Yeah, exactly. Because the people in Strikeforce, WEC, and stuff, it was like, in a way, it's like we're using this as a stepping stone to get to UFC because UFC is trying to go that extra mile and put together these huge fights and really establish themselves as the top dog, and that the promotion that's going to take over in the next 2 years, like they have.
Well, like, even like with go to that UFC Strikeforce Pride type, like there was a time in the 2000s like where Pride was better than the UFC, and that was actually a real conversation. And same thing with Strikeforce. The conversation was, well, could Gilbert Melendez go to the UFC and win the lightweight title, or could Nick Diaz fight George St. Pierre and win the welterweight title? Like nowadays, you can have those conversations with certain fighters from the PFL, but we're not having them often because they're not fighting.
They're not getting the chance. It's like Patchy Mix said, he's not getting the chance to prove it, and he wants the chance to prove it.
And he's a type, like I said before, I truly think him versus Merab, that's a good fight. I'd love to see who would win that fight, but when Patchy Mix isn't fighting, I'm not just gonna bring it up.
Exactly.
It's they have to give me a reason to bring it up. We're not gonna you can't cover a promotion that's not giving you something to cover.
When Merab's now got two legit worthy opponents that we're talking about that can fight him in the near future, Patchy Mix is just like, dude, give me
He's struggling
somebody.
for one.
Yeah. Give me one opponent,
Yeah, and even AJ McKee, he said that too. He's like, I want my rematch, but he's like, I feel bad. He's like, I want to see him fight. He's one of the best fighters in the world. Why is he not fighting? And it's just like, this is confusing. Yeah. And it's confusing to all of us. But
yeah, but that's all obviously once at the end of the day, it's a business and stuff. This is these people's livelihoods. Like, it's just stuff that we obviously can't actually get access to and really bring into light. At the end of the day, just using our platform to try and express hey, we as fans want to see the best in the world compete as much as possible. They themselves want to compete as much as possible, and they're not being allowed to.
And to the PFL side, me speaking as a fan, I want to see the PFL do well. I hate making videos like this where we have to criticize them because, why would I want to do that when I want to see this promotion compete with the UFC? But it's you got to give us more to work with, And, the only things we're getting to talk about are your Bellator champions shitting on the promotion. It's not a good look, man, especially when their whole thing is being fighter first. But that's the story. It was interesting to hop into a little bit. We'll see how it evolves in the next few months and if those guys get fights like they want. But until then, we have another pod that came out tonight talking about UFC Macau. Go check that out. Tomorrow we're gonna have a video coming out about the whole Conor McGregor situation that happened. That's gonna be a long conversation and a tough one, but definitely check that out. And next week, since there's no UFC fights or anything like that, we have Dennis Bermudez interview coming up with Tiz. I think I mentioned that on the last pod. I mentioned it on the UFC Macau pod as well. So definitely be on the lookout for that early next week. And yeah, so we'll see y'all next time.